All right, welcome to this session of the National War Tax Resistance Coordinating Committee. This session is our panel on the new treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons and paths forward for resistance. This session is featuring 3 anti-nuclear activists to share their thoughts on the treaty and speak to the future of the anti-nuclear movement, which was a driving force for many people who became war tax resistors during the 1970s and 1980s. This panel will feature Mari Inoue, an attorney and co-founder of the Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World, Dr. Linda Richards, historian of science and a grassroots activist since 1986 for nuclear disarmament, and Jack Cohen Joppa, a co-founder of the Nuclear Resistor newsletter, which began in 1980 and continues to provide information and support for imprisoned anti-nuclear activists and anti-war activists. That's a very brief introduction. I'm sure as our speakers go, they will share more about themselves and their activism as they speak. Each of the speakers has been allotted about 15 to 20 minutes. And after each of our 3 speakers has spoken, then we'll open it up for questions. So at this time, Mari will be our first speaker. So thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lincoln. And thank you for organizing this event. And it's a great honor to be here with other distinguished guests. I'm so happy to be able to speak about our activities here in New York City and also what we've been doing in the past to abolish nuclear weapons. Let me share my screen. All right. Great. So my name is Mari Inoue. I'm a co-founder of Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World. Manhattan Project for a Nuclear-Free World was established in March 2012, 1 year after the Fukushima disaster. We had 2 families from Fukushima who came to New York City, and a dozen of representatives of civil society groups gathered, and we talked about organizing an event together. And we decided to continue to meet regularly on a monthly basis to talk about nuclear issues, not just nuclear weapons, but also issues related to nuclear energy. And our mission is to undo the unconscionable labors of the original Manhattan Project that unleashed nuclear weapons and nuclear power upon the world. And we picked this name to remind ourselves that we first met in Manhattan, and also we believe that it's a teachable moment for young people who do not know the original Manhattan Project. So we organize educational events, publish informative materials such as the flyer like this one on the right. Also, we reach out to elected officials and environmental organizations, and also give platform to victims of nuclear disasters and plan field trips to places related to Manhattan Project. In the past, we've been to a couple places that are directly related to the original Manhattan Project in New York City. One is the Robert Oppenheimer's childhood home in Manhattan, West Side, Upper West Side. The other one is the statue of Sinan Shonin, which survived Hiroshima bombing. I think it was about 1 mile from the Hyper Center and donated to the Japanese Buddhist church in 1950s. Also in Staten Island, there was a uranium storage site where uranium from the Belgian Congo which was used for Hiroshima bomb, was stored for a couple of years. And we went there with the Geiger counter to make sure that it's not radioactive. And he wasn't, the background radiation was similar to other parts of the city. We also have been to the most radioactive place in New York City to let people know that radioactive places are everywhere in our city. And this is the place where about 100 years ago, there was a chemical plant near the Queens and Brooklyn border that produced rare earth material, rare earth metals. And as a byproduct, it produces radioactive thorium. They started selling radioactive thorium to Atomic Energy Commission after the war, but before the World War II, they have been just dumping the radioactive waste in the sewer system, or just storing in the backyard. And they had a couple of explosions in the past. And they knew that this place was radioactive for a long time, but EPA didn't designate this site until almost like 7 years ago. And finally, it's designated as a Superfund site. And they put 2 inches of lead and 4 inches of steel under the entire block. But we went there with the Geiger counter, but the background radiation was extremely high, and we don't recommend young people or pregnant women go there. One of the things that we've been doing every year since 2015 is to gather a peace gathering in front of the Japanese consulate in New York City. We've been co-organizing with the Veterans for Peace New York City chapter and a dozen of peace organizations. And we also deliver a letter to the high-level officials of the Japanese consulate, asking them to play a leadership role in signing and promoting, ratifying and promoting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We also request them to support the peace process in the Korean Peninsula by having a dialogue with both countries, DPRK and Republic of Korea. And these are the photos from 2019 in front of the Japanese consulate. And in 2020, because of the COVID, New York City was really hit around this time, and this was August. But we were able to set up a meeting with the high-level officials there. So we delivered a letter and a bouquet of flowers with the condition that we wear face masks and the face shield. But they've been telling us that they're not going to sign the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons because they want to be protected under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. So it's quite depressing every time we go there. We know that what they're going to say, but nonetheless, they keep saying that every year. So instead of having a peace gathering in front of the consulate last year, we decided to organize an online event. And this was the program of the online event. We had a testimony from Hibakusha, atomic bomb survivor from Hiroshima. She was 91 years old, yes, last year. We also had music and this one. They were young physicians in Heart. They graduated from the Nagasaki University Medical School, and they work full-time as physicians, but also they sing anti-nuclear song. And it was a wonderful event. So also what we do as part of the Mehan Project for Nuclear Free World, we talk about the cost and human consequences of nuclear disaster, not just about nuclear weapons. Fukushima disaster was a wake-up call for many of us. And I'm not going to talk details about this, but we talk about how Japanese government raised the permissible level of radiation after the Fukushima disaster when they designated evacuation zones by applying 20 millisieverts per year standard, which was 20 times higher radiation than pre-disaster standard, which was not acceptable. And there was anti-nuclear energy movement started by family farmers in Fukushima, young mothers in Fukushima, which spread to bigger cities such as in Tokyo. And this is the photo in front of the official residence of the prime minister. And thousands of people showed up opposing to restart nuclear power plant. And they still continue to use nuclear energy as the energy policy. We also talk about the food safety standards, how they implemented a very relaxed food safety standard after Fukushima disaster, and how people fought for stricter standard. It took almost 2 years to get that 100 becquerels per 100 becquerels per kilogram standard in terms of radioactive cesium, because right after the disaster, they implemented 500 becquerels per kilogram standard in terms of cesium. And what it means is that before the Fukushima disaster, there was a standard called clearance level to distinguish regular waste from radioactive waste, and that was 100 becquerels per kilogram. So when they imposed this 500 becquerels per kilogram, we argue that basically you're saying that you can give low-level radioactive waste to pregnant women and children, and that is not acceptable. So people fought for it for stricter standard. One of the amazing development in Japan after the Fukushima disaster was mothers who played a role in resistance because Japanese government refused to conduct the soil measurement of radiation after the disaster, but people were afraid whether their food are safe enough or whether the water is safe enough to consume. So mothers, some of them did not have science background. They started playing an important role in establishing the radiation measurement laboratories in different parts of Japan, not just in Fukushima Prefecture. So this booklet was published by the Minano data site in 2017 after 3 years of long projects. More than 4,000 volunteers were involved, and they collected 3,400 soil samples from 17 prefectures. Japan has about 47 prefectures, and this is only a part of Japan, about 1/3 of Japan. And this is Fukushima, Daiichi nuclear power plant, which had an accident, and Tokyo area is around here. So around here, there are about like 20 million people living just in this area. So this was an amazing project. And mothers played a role in making this happen. And based on the soil measurement, they were able to calculate the radiation level in 2011. And based on that, they could calculate what the radiation level would be 10 years, 20 years, even 100 years from the accident. And this was inspired by the soil measurement map created by Russia and Belarus after the Chernobyl disaster. So we also talk about the implication of Tokyo Olympics, how Prime Minister Abe declared that the Fukushima Daiichi was under control. And because of that, Japan was able to win its bid to host 2000 Summer Olympics game. but because of the COVID-19, the Olympics was postponed to this year. Now there are many COVID cases, so I don't know what is going to happen. But they also have some issues with the locations. So I'm not going to talk in details. So we also gather testimonies of victims of Fukushima disaster and posted in our YouTube channel. So if you're interested in learning more, please go to the YouTube and Google, type Mahan Project for Nuclear Free World, and you will see some of the videos that we have posted in the past. And this year we posted additional video testimonies from the radiation laboratory, radiation laboratories who showed what kind of activities they do and so on. So please take a look. We also talk about lessons from Fukushima. This was prepared by Fukushima Booklet Committee, available in 15 languages. And also we talk about strategies taken by state and governments and so-called experts and companies who try to downplay the situation after the industrial disaster like Fukushima. And there are similarities between Minamata and Fukushima. And by the way, the movie Minamata will be shown sometime this year. So I'm looking forward to that movie. So now here in the US, in New York, Indian Point nuclear power plant is located 25 miles north of the northern border of New York City. And the final and the third nuclear reactor was shut down just yesterday. So it was a historical moment, but now the issue shifts to how to deal with radioactive waste. We don't know what to do with the radioactive waste, and we have to continue to keep an eye on the decommissioning process, including who will be responsible and whether the public's opinion will be reflected to the decommissioning process. One of the things that we did with other groups this year was Roses to Missions Action, which was in January. On January 22nd, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons went into force, and we wanted to send a thank you notes to all the 51 countries and states that ratified the treaty. So we divided into 8 teams and delivered yellow roses and thank you notes to them. And these are the photos of the action. However, we didn't get much media response from this action, mainly from Japanese media. The only US media was a small Westchester media, which published our entire press release, but that was it. So US media didn't pay close attention to the our action, unfortunately. That's one of the challenges that we have to overcome. So Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons entered into force on January 22nd. And this one not only prohibits the development, production or manufacturing of nuclear weapons, but also it prohibits assisting and encouraging or inducing anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to the state party under this treaty. So this includes those who are protected under the nuclear umbrella of the United States. So basically, being protected under the nuclear umbrella of nuclear weapon state could be considered as a form of assisting and encouraging nuclear weapon states to engage in unlawful activity under this treaty. So how to raise awareness of this treaty in the US? You can reach out to your elected officials and ask them to sign the ICANN pledge. Also, you can ask your cities to implement resolutions that aligns with the nuclear ban treaty. And one of the things that we've been supporting and trying to put this to vote is that there are three significant resolutions and bill in New York City Council. First two bill and resolution are related to the nuclear weapons TPNW, and the third one is related to shifting the money from military budget and instead use the fund to aid municipalities like New York City in our time of need. So these three resolutions bill introduced in 2019, but because of COVID, it stalled, and now we are campaigning, trying to push the city council to put them to vote so that you will be part of the New York City legislation. And one of the issues with the United States and Japan Defense Cooperation is that it specifically says the United States will continue to extend deterrence to Japan through the full range of capabilities, including US nuclear forces. And this is the reason why Japan claims that they cannot sign the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So in order for them to sign the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, they'll have to make bold policy changes that could take years. And now these are the flyers published every year, updated every year by Nagasaki University Research Center, Nuclear Weapons Abolition. And here, as you can see, it's kind of small, but Japan has more than 45 tons of plutonium. So 5 countries, US, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and Japan, held most of the global non-military stockpile of separated plutonium. So why Japan has such amount of plutonium? Because Japan depends on nuclear energy. So from nuclear power plants, they produce separated plutonium. So not just nuclear weapons, we have to raise voices against nuclear energy as well. So thank you so much. I think I talked too much, more than 20 minutes, but thank you so much for listening.
I'm muted. Yes, thank you, Mari, for your wonderful presentation. And if everyone wasn't muted, I'm sure we'd be hearing their clapping in the background. So yeah, someone put a question in the chat, but we'll save that question for after all of our panelists have spoken. So our next panelist is Jack Cohen Joppa, and I am adding him to our spotlight for the moment. Here we go. And so I'll hand it over to Jack.
Thanks, Lincoln. I appreciate the opportunity today to share some of my experiences about war tax resistance and our work with the nuclear resistor and towards the completion of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'm coming to you this morning from Tucson, Arizona. This is traditional territories of the Tohono O'odham people, with Apache and Yaqui also residing here. want to introduce a little bit of the work that we do with the nuclear resistor, that Felice, my wife, and I do with the nuclear resistor, by way of my own introduction to war tax resistance, which came as a college student in the mid-1970s. And I learned about Thoreau, but I didn't really know about the contemporary war tax resistance movement. At that time, I had a draft number, but they were no longer conscripting people. But I knew that I didn't want to participate in war. And so I'd gone through the process to be a conscientious objector, even though it didn't matter at that point in time, just so they knew that I wasn't going to go along with the war making that I saw in my future. And I'd read some prison memoirs, and I was interested to correspond with prisoners just as part of my own political education. And a philosophy instructor that I had at the University of Colorado gave me a copy of The Peacemaker, which was a thin little tabloid with a big history. I know that some of you on this call know the history of the peacemakers, but just to fill it in briefly, as I understood it, conscientious objectors and their partners coming out of World War II wanted to continue to develop the pacifism that they had exemplified as conscientious objectors. And so they needed an organ of communication, and that became the newsletter and the loose national organization known as the Peacemakers. And by the 1970s, the Peacemaker newsletter had kept track of people in prison as conscientious objectors during the Vietnam era, thousands of people. And it had evolved into a little network of people sharing their own experiences of nonviolence, war tax resistance, prisoner advocacy, et cetera. And so reading The Peacemaker introduced me to the contemporary war tax resistance movement. And when I read some of the literature, I believe I was reading things that came from the Center on Law and Pacifism out of Colorado Springs, Colorado, Bill and Jeannie Durland. And it made sense. If I didn't want war, if I wasn't going to participate in war, then I shouldn't be paying for war. And as a student at that time, it was easy to claim a student exemption to withholding. But for a semester, I was not a student and I had a job at a restaurant, and the personnel office didn't want to recognize my claiming multiple exemptions on my W-4, because I realized that I could practice W-4 resistance, claim multiple exemptions, not have any withholding, and then it's up to me to justify it in the end when I file a return. And I walked away from the job kind of in tears, because I thought, oh, this is going to be a challenge not to pay taxes. But that was a decision that I made that I would like to try to do in my life. It seemed a worthwhile thing to do. It made so much sense. So at that same time, I got involved in the protests at the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons factory outside of Denver, because that was contemporaneous and it just fit in with what seemed the sensible thing to do. And from that work, became aware of people who were going to jail or would likely to go to jail in the anti-nuclear movement. By then, I'd come to understand some of the power of nonviolence, and I was an advocate of nonviolent direct action. And so with that and my prisoner advocacy that I'd started to do, I realized that with the help of some friends, that in any movement for social change, people go to jail. War tax resistors, war resistors, feminists, labor organizers, civil rights workers in the United States. In all of these movements, people went to jail. That was part of the movement. And we needed to support the people who were in jail. And so started publishing a little newsletter with that as our goal. And we just last week mailed out the 197th issue of the Nuclear Resistor newsletter. However, the last year, a little bit more than a year, has been a challenge in our work, because with the pandemic, no one wants to risk, going to jail. No one wants to put themselves in that context of, close confined quarters with a contagious viral disease that's possibly fatal. No one wants to put the police in that situation, to be handling people in close quarters who are engaging in civil disobedience. And so the practice of civil disobedience as part of the anti-war movement, anti-nuclear movement, has greatly diminished in the light of the pandemic. But at the same time, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has come into force. And so now we have a new tool in our basket of toolbox to address the nuclear weapons issue and work towards abolition. And in that regard, for the work of the nuclear resistor, back over a year ago, we had imagined that we knew the treaty would come into force. And when it came into force, that was a great opportunity for coordinated actions around the country that would involve traditional civil disobedience and perhaps more creative actions like the Plowshares actions to help public education about this new legal instrument that closes the legal gap between prohibition and total acceptance of nuclear weapons. All other weapons of mass destruction have been prohibited by international convention, except nuclear weapons until this last year. And we were inspired by the work of ICANN and recognized that ICANN, when they won the Nobel Peace Prize, they acknowledged the people who had engaged in nonviolent direct action. They acknowledged that our movement is very broad. It's not just arms control experts. It's not just academics. It's not just legal scholars. It's grassroots activists. And this is what they've been doing. And this is how they've supported the movement for nuclear abolition, is by putting their bodies on the line. Well, we were going to have a conference. We hope to have a conference organizing with Nuke Watch and the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance. We planned to have a conference just about a year ago this month. We had to cancel those plans in light of the pandemic. And last fall, when it became clear that the 50th nation would ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and then trigger its entry into force, as Mari pointed out, occurred in January. Ardith Platte and Carol Gilbert, two Dominican sisters who live in Washington, D.C., who had been very involved in the efforts of ICANN in New York City and promoting the treaty across the U.S., they implored us to like help them think about what to do when the treaty comes into force in light of our current political situation. Trump is still president, et cetera, et cetera. So sadly, a few weeks after that, Ardith Platte passed away in her sleep peacefully. And so we felt obliged to take up the banner. And with our friends again at the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance, the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability, and Nuke Watch, we organized a series of Zoom calls. Maybe some of you were on them in October, November, December, January, forget now. Yeah, I guess the last one was in December, and then just in January prior to the entry into force. We again met on Zoom, encouraging people to engage in public actions around the country with some common graphic material, et cetera, to begin where we're at now with the treaty, which is really the public education in the United States. That's the foundation of any successful nonviolent direct action, is to have an informed public about the issues. And sometimes nonviolent direct action can be used to move that education process along. So there were on and around January 22nd, there were over 100 public demonstrations around the United States. People took the opportunity to demonstrate at universities, at financial institutions, both of which have ties that have been documented into the nuclear weapons industry, to go to elected officials on state, local, and national level to encourage their support for the treaty and to sign, as Mari pointed out, there's the legislative and the parliamentary pledges that have been developed by ICANN and an organization, Nuclear Ban US, here in the United States, to move this organizing along. Let's see. So there was, oh, my notes here are a little bit jumbled because I didn't get to finish them up yesterday, but to move this organizing along, there was quite a bit of energy and enthusiasm going into January 22nd. We thought that it would be useful to see if this energy can be transformed, to continue the process of promoting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And so what has come out of that organizing is a handful of working groups that were formed around the work that's already been done and around the provisions of the treaty. And those working groups have now begun to meet on Zoom, just a handful of, 5, 10 people from around the country, who are working locally on the different aspects of promoting the treaty. So there are now established about 8 different working groups. Don't bank on the bomb or divestment. Legislative pledges, working with organizations like Mayors for Peace and the ICANN Cities Appeal. People who are doing outreach to faith communities. There have been a number of initiatives in faith communities to educate and promote the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Affected communities, downwinders, uranium miners, Hibakusha living in the United States. Signatories on the treaty have an obligation to remediate areas that have been affected by their nuclear weapons enterprise. So looking forward to the United States acceding to the treaty, we want to be involved with the affected communities. Remediation and environmental cleanup, also part of the provisions of the treaty. Schools of mass destruction. This is the project the ICANN worked on to identify at least 50 universities in the United States that have some documented ties to the nuclear weapons industry. It's not just the University of California that manages Lawrence Livermore and the Los Alamos National Laboratories to produce nuclear weapons, but it's even places like here, the University of Arizona has a management agreement with Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico. We're not clear. We've asked what they do. We haven't heard a response. So that's part of our campaigning locally, but basically they are educating, cultivating, grooming the next generation of nuclear weapons professionals, be they management, be they physicists, be they politicians who have accepted that this is the future of humanity, that yes, nuclear weapons is a fine thing and we ought to make it our academic enterprise to do it right. So schools of mass destruction. Policy and advocacy work is another working group that's been formed. And finally, a days of action working group, because we do foresee a day when we'll be able to be out in public in more nonviolent, direct activity that challenges the nuclear industry. And then when we go to court, as happens when people engage in civil disobedience, as happens to war tax resistors who run afoul and are prosecuted, we now have another tool to argue why our refusal to participate is lawful. And in fact, the weapons that we're opposing are illegal. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons spells that out clearly. So looking forward, we're seeing that this is one way to promote organizing around these different facets of the treaty to build public awareness and provide a foundation for both legal public action as well as nonviolent direct action, war tax resistance, civil disobedience. And I think I'll wrap it up there and encourage people to get involved. If you'd like to get involved, I'm sorry I can't screen share because I'm working with just an iPad. We're trying to upgrade our technology now after we've seen the needs and the potentials in this last year. If you'd like to get involved, it's a very simple email address to email Ralph Hutchison at the Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance. And I will put it in the chat when I can fiddle with the keyboard on my iPad. His email address is OREP, Oak Ridge Environmental Peace, OREP@earthlink.net. And Ralph can help get you connected to a working group, share with you the list of the working groups that are in process, etc. I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you, Jack, so much for sharing your wisdom and years of experience in this movement. And we will now move on to hear from our final speaker this afternoon, Linda Richards. So just adding her to the spotlight. And all right, take it. Oh, I hand it over to you, Linda.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
I hope it's the right, suddenly sometimes it won't let you do your slide the right size. I don't know why that happens sometimes. All my practice on Zoom doesn't matter. Well, I'm so excited to be here. I'm sorry, my slides are going to be small. Maybe if I do try it a different way, we'll see. Can you see the large slide now?
Yep, looks perfect.
Oh, great. Okay. So I'm so happy to be here with all of you, and I'm so grateful to be included in this today with Lincoln and Jack and Mari and all of you that have come. I'm Linda Richards from the OSU History Department, and I'm a member of the Linus Pauling Veterans for Peace chapter, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the National Association of Atomic Veterans. And with Bill, who's here, I'm a member of Corvallis Divest from War. And near the end of my talk, Bill will share our local campaign. But I want to first locate my position as a descendant of some of the first Oregon resettlers in 1847. I'm grateful to be supported by the land cultivated by the Pinafu Band of the Kalapuya people, who were forced by my ancestors to leave their homelands here in Corvallis, Oregon in 1855. My aim in my work is to show social justice movements to end violence and nuclear abolition movements are but one interconnected human rights struggle. And here I'm just going to blast through a few of my published articles, but these titles, along with my dissertation, are available for free at my website, atomiclinda.com. And several of them deal with fallout exposure, and I actually am a member of the affected working group. So I'm really happy to follow Jack and be able to thank him for organizing that new group. So I'm in the affected communities group just temporarily until we find more affected communities that have the capacity to participate fully in their own voices. So I think I began my teaching. I wasn't a grassroots activist most of my life. You're going to hear about that. And today I'm only going to share a bit of how I came to this story about nuclear exposure and human rights as a human rights struggle. But I was really struck with the reminder of the connections between human rights and white nuclear technological supremacy when Michael Brown was killed by police in Ferguson, Missouri, August 9th, 2014. It made me rededicate my dissertation in my mind to a book manuscript that would be about human rights and nuclear wrongs, which is the title of it, to try and link these things together. And as a child, in 1972, I vowed to this photo of Kim Phuc that I would end war. It's a picture I saw on my 9th birthday when my father was deployed in Vietnam. I'm sure many of you are familiar with her picture, this picture, but she is the little girl, for those of you that aren't familiar, with her arms held like a peace crane. And I did not fully understand the message that I saw until I was 18 at my first nonviolence training in Eugene, actually, to prepare for protests against the US-sponsored terrorism and wars in Latin America. When the trainers showed the photo at the training, the hair stood up on my neck, and I finally realized there was actually something I could do about war besides read books like No More War by Linus Pauling. If I learned nonviolence, I might be able to actually keep my vow to Kim Phuc to end war. This led me to learning about nonviolence and to walk on the 9.5-month walk from LA to DC. I'm actually this person, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm this walker right here as we go up Loveland Pass. But I grew up as an Army brat. I actually had no skills for nonviolence. So I embraced it with all the enthusiasm of a complete beginner. And I continue to struggle to practice nonviolence, growing up in a violent home with a Vietnam veteran. But I also knew as an Army brat that most military people didn't like nuclear weapons either, and that perhaps This would be a place to start and a way to build international law and trust to end war. This was a vision I had read actually in Linus Pauling's No More War, my favorite book as a child. So it was on this walk where I made a second vow. I was asked while visiting Big Mountain by the late Roberta Blackgoat and other Hopi, Dene, and Pueblo elders and widows of uranium miners to honor, carry, and tell their stories of violence done to them due to radioactive colonialism. Here is Roberta's words about uranium mining. They're greedy to get the minerals out from here, but we need to have Mother Earth to be healed. Her thinking was similar to that of Carrie Dan's, who said, we are eating our children. And I used to have to explain what that meant, but now many more Americans understand the spoiling of the earth in the present, that this spoiling is an existential threat for future generations. And my promise to those harmed by radioactivity in 1986 eventually led me to discover the vastness of the harm, including I learned from my favorite uncle, Vic Jehola, a Korean War decorated hero, that he was an atomic soldier. And I often hunt in these photos looking for him, but it seared my soul when he told me shot dog was more terrifying than all the battles and killing in Korea. And he told me it was my patriotic duty to try and ban nuclear weapons. I lived under the poverty line for many years and kept my vows by simply talking each day to a new person about the harms I was learning about. I sent a letter of protest every year, holding back a portion of my taxes. But at a certain point, your organization, Northwest National War Tax Resistance, you all had to send me back the money so I could re-enroll in college to finish college. But I was so grateful to have had the opportunity to resist, even if it were only for a limited amount of time and in small ways. So I wanted to thank you all today. I was so touched when Bill asked me to speak. In college, I learned more. Estimates are that 80 to 90% of the nuclear fuel chain, the mining and milling of uranium, the production and testing of nuclear weapons, nuclear power plants, and nuclear waste storage occurs near Indigenous people's land and in communities of color worldwide. I studied, held events, nonviolence trainings, commemorations, protests, vigils, and worked on campaigns with Mayors for Peace, but it was never enough. Eventually, I was invited to attend the graduate program here at the History of Science at Oregon State University due to my obsessions about human rights, nuclear history, and harm. I went to international meetings where I tried to get a focus on human rights and the harms that were occurring presently. And I eventually studied, went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Navajo Nation, Elliott Lake, the National Archives, and I went to multiple UN agencies to try and find answers. And this Hiroshima Peace Park sculpture captures some of the atrocity of nuclear weapons for me. The sculpture is like this painting, which I saw in the Hiroshima Peace Museum, showing people dissolving. And I woke up every day obsessed. Why are there no human rights protocols against nuclear weapons? How can one life mean anything if all of existence can be threatened by the power of the few? What is a right then? Why was there no human rights protocols to protect us and future generations from nuclear weapons and contamination? How can we fight suicide if nuclear weapons exist? Messaging to all of us our worthlessness. It was as if there was a tear in reality in the moment of the explosion, making all our relations disordered. And this poem captures this loss of humanity. Give back my father, give back my mother, give grandpa back, grandma back, give my sons and daughters back, give me back myself, give back the human race. As long as this life lasts, this life, give back peace that will never end. Eventually, in my researching, I found it was the UN's faith in nuclear science for development that is part of the reason why we have no rights against nuclear weapons or nuclear pollution. Nuclear science was described by Gerald Wendt of UNESCO in 1955 as the lifeblood of the underprivileged peoples. Nuclear science was conceptualized as a new frontier whose practice would serve as a treasure house to lift the burdens of hunger, poverty, and disease. They meant well, they argued, they still do. They say they have the long view, and it is activists who are short-sighted. Another reason we don't have the human rights we deserve is because of the reach of the U.S. Atomic Energy Agency and their version of radiation health safety, which you've heard just some of from Mari today. I saw the details of how the Atomic Energy Commission and the UN used, how the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, used the UN levers of power through technical experts without scrutiny or notice to make the nuclear world as we know it. Ironically, it is nuclear technology that was spread in the name of human rights, as a right to literally nuclear science and education, nuclear medicine, and nuclear power for development. This power has only increased and been elevated to an inalienable right for nations to pursue peaceful nuclear technology in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, ironically, and unfortunately, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons restates that right, dramatically underestimating the role of peaceful technologies and creating the conditions for nuclear war. So my book manuscript will share much more of the story along with the various future publications from my National Science Foundation grant, which I work on with Dr. Jacob Darwin Hamlin, reconstructing nuclear environments and the Downwinders case. And please, I want to encourage you all this summer to learn more aspects of the construction of the nuclear war in Jacob Darwin Hamlin's book, available from Oxford Press this summer. At OSU, I continue to teach and learn about the human rights violations of nuclear technologies that contaminate the earth while disproportionately affecting Indigenous peoples, people of color, and those with less power, often those very communities that are policed as unsafe. So much links all these struggles. Just as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and others have said, we must work and look where injustice, poverty, and war overlap. Now there are many resources and radiation survivors are able to speak in their own voices. So I encourage you to download the Uranium Atlas if you haven't already. It's a wonderful resource. I try to make these connections visible in all my work. I've done activities that span from planting peace trees to lectures to petitions with the Oregon PSR protesting the acceptance of grant money to simulate nuclear weapons tests in the OSU Nuclear Engineering Department. But the projects I'm most proud of now are SMJ5, which was a state memorial to align Oregon with the treaty. And we did that work with, Bill and I did that work with Oregon PSR. And now we currently are working on our local Corvallis Divest resolution. Here's just a glance at the SMJ5 resolution. I kind of selected out my favorite parts, but we're not going to look at this right now. I just want to encourage you all to look it up, I guess. I really want to turn to Bill. I was supposed to turn on my timer when I started talking, and somehow I didn't push the button hard enough. So I have no idea how long I've talked. But I just want to encourage everyone to do what they can on local to international levels, right? As we all are already. But I really wanted to share Bill's work on our divest resolution. So I hope Bill's here. I'm introducing you, Bill.
Hi, thanks to everyone for the talks. I'm Bill Glassmeyer from Corvallis, Oregon, which is where Linda lives. We are working, Corvallis Divest from War, to convince the city to divest from all military weapons production companies. Examples are Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. The substance of our resolution is that we in Corvallis would like our investments in our city government to work for a better world. We enumerate some of the harms of war in general, nuclear, not just nuclear. And finally, we have a clause which prohibits the city from investing with in companies who produce military weapons. This work it started at a meeting sponsored by Code Pink a couple of years ago. Right now, Corvallis is the only city I know of that's actually working on such a resolution. There is much more interest these days in divesting from fossil fuels than there is in divesting from war. And I had one other thing to say. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Oh yes, and we're trying to work together with progressive groups in other areas on their projects and to combine their efforts. My belief is we all need to work together as much as we can to struggle against the power of entrenched in the establishment, basically. And the military establishment is very hard to work with. Anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm turning it back over to you, Lincoln.
It's actually a really beautiful resolution because Bill composed it, and he's a wonderful composer.
Keep forgetting to unmute myself. Thank you again to Linda, and thank you for Bill for sharing some insights also of what's happening in Corvallis. And I'm going to add back to our spotlight here, Jack and Mari, and we have plenty of time, and I'll open it up to questions. So I guess just a reminder, the way that with the spotlight and the recording happening, if you unmute yourself to ask a question, we'll hear you, but for the recording, we won't see you. We'll just see our speakers.
There was a question in the chat.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, it already got answered too. The question about the New York universities. But you know, that's actually an interesting point. I actually, when I saw the answer, I wanted to chime in, but I was a little bit distracted. You know, the separation between peaceful and not peaceful nuclear research is very difficult because so many of the nuclear engineers can take the skills that they have and apply it to either. And they're trained kind of to be able to apply them to either. And they visit, you know, very often the nuclear engineering department. I really appreciate their, I don't know how to explain that I appreciate their commitment that they have in their minds that they have the answer for climate change. I don't agree, of course. Anyone who's been on listening this hour knows this is a very dangerous route for the future. But they frequently go to the nuclear military labs where they learn, you know, what skills do the nuclear engineers need to get these really great jobs. And it's actually been a protected class, nuclear engineers, for some time, I believe, because they're a national security interest. Students that pursue nuclear engineering get kinds of support that other students would never have. And I interviewed nuclear engineers a few years ago, many of them having these amazing careers with just an undergraduate degree. So they're very well prepared. And that, I said too much. But anyway, that's my thoughts.
I might also just add to that, yeah, a lot of activities are prohibited in states parties within the countries that have ratified the treaty. And so people may think that it has no force in the United States, but it does, at least to begin with. It has a moral force in this country. And then to the extent that US universities collaborate with universities in states parties countries, that collaboration is a target for education about the treaty and perhaps questioning whether the US university has any right to be involved when they're also involved in nuclear weapons work here. So that, and it works in similar ways, perhaps with banking and investments. And those are definitely, you know, two of the paths that ICANN US is encouraging us to be organizing on.
Yeah, one thing I would like to add is that Japan, which is not nuclear weapon states, but once in a while, conservative elected official will say something like, oh, Japan has all the material, knowledge, resources, experts in order to make nuclear weapons. All we need is just a couple of weeks or a couple of months to assemble them. So, you know, what does it mean? It means that nuclear energy will provide enough material, fission material, fissile material to make nuclear arsenal. And we have to pay close attention to that.
Thank you. There are a couple questions in the chat. So the first one is more directed to Mari. If you could speak more about the Tokyo Olympics starting in Fukushima.
Yeah, so Tokyo Olympics is will be held in Tokyo, but also a couple of games will be held in Fukushima City, which is more than 100 miles away from Tokyo, because Fukushima, this Tokyo Olympics is considered as a reconstruction event to highlight that situation in Fukushima is under control when it is not. So there will be softball game and one baseball game will be held in Fukushima City, which I think is another issue, gender-related issue, because softball game is for ladies and baseball game is for men. And entire softball game will be held in Fukushima City, and only one baseball game will be held in Fukushima City. So, you know, I think that it's really gender biased or, you know, against women. But issues related to torch relay, which happened already, was that the torch relay started at the J Village, which was the hub for decommissioning process of the Kripal nuclear power plant. And TEPCO, the owner of the Kripal power plant, used that place to store radioactive waste until 2017, and they didn't decontaminate that area after that. So people, local people, measured the radiation in that area, not just the J Village, but other parts of Fukushima. And they have measured some, you know, alarming, you know, spots here and there. But torch relay already happened, and now our COVID situation is getting worse. We don't know what is going to happen, but I personally think that they have to cancel the Olympics.
Thank you. I'll skip around a little bit. So if I skipped your question, I'm coming back to it. So another question in the chat, which is really for anybody, since the US hasn't signed the Nuclear Prohibition Treaty, does that mean under UN rules, we don't have to follow the treaty?
Linda, go.
Well, I just wanted to make one thing clear. This actually has been kind of a miscommunication, I think, in a certain way. But the treaty works how international law works, which means it's by consensus. So the treaty actually realistically only applies to the countries that sign it. But the goal is to create a new norm. And I'm sure the others can talk more about this. But legally, it's only for the countries that have signed it.
And I think that much will, I was just starting to type in reply to Ann's question, that as I understand it, much will depend upon how the states parties agree to pursue their own enforcement with each other of the provisions of the treaty. So that the states parties could say, well, like, we all agree that none of our countries should have anything to do with any of the banks that have anything to do with the nuclear weapons industry. And so then it does begin to affect the financial institutions here in the United States and elsewhere that are invested in the nuclear weapons industry. So that conference, I believe, has just been set for January of 2022 for the first meeting of the states parties. And that will begin then that long process of how they'll choose to enforce the treaty and bring them all in line with it. But Linda's absolutely right. We're here to stigmatize nuclear weapons now. This is our job, is to change the narrative and to no longer say, oh, well, yeah, that physics work they're doing at OSU about verifying nuclear testing around the world by simulating it in our labs. No, that's not legitimate work under the treaty.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I just want to add that, entry into force only means that a nuclear weapon is considered illegal under international law. So United States can always ignore international law. And another thing that I wanted to say during my presentation, but I forgot, was that state parties who ratified the treaty received threats from nuclear weapon states, including United States. And United States pressured them not to sign or ratify, or if they already ratified, then unratify. Despite these pressure, they continue to ratify and continue to stay. So that's why we wanted to say thank you to those state parties, because most of them are developing countries, states of the South. And they don't have much resources, but nonetheless, they stood up against powerful countries like United States, Russia, France, UK. So, hats off for them.
Here are two questions directed to Mari. Since the situation at the Fukushima plant, has Japan made any policy changes concerning nuclear power plants? And then a slightly different question that also relates to your presentation. Is there a community of color living around the nuclear Superfund site described as the Irving Avenue in Ridgewood, New York?
Thank you so much for the question. About the nuclear policy in Japan, they continue to promote nuclear energy as national policy. They did make stricter standard to restart nuclear power plants. But other than that, they haven't changed much at all. So evacuation zones or food safety standards, I don't think it's adequate enough. And what happened was that a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health went to Japan and conducted investigation 2 years after the disaster. And he made a long list of recommendations to Japan, asking them to implement important policy changes. Those are ignored, unfortunately. And there's another UN Special Rapporteur on toxic waste. He expressed repeatedly that he is interested in visiting Japan to conduct investigation at the crippled power plant, including distillation of the contaminated waste there, including the contaminated water stored in the facility. But Japan refused to invite him to Japan. So his term expired last year. So he's not going to visit Japan. So that's the situation. The government is not that helpful in improving the situation there in terms of human rights. The second question was, New York City. We went there a couple of years ago. I think it was 2016. And we noticed that across the street from that location, there was an old apartment building, which was vacated. I think the city asked them to vacate. But across that apartment building, so like, across the street from there, there was a new condominium built. Yeah, and we checked online, and it seems like a one-bedroom apartment was like a $300,000 or something. So it's not a cheap apartment. So relatively, maybe middle-class people will move in. So it's not just So I don't know whether these people will know that that location is designated as Superfund site.
Thank you. Another question, which is, I guess, probably directed to each of you. Can you speak to actions we can take to curtail a new generation of nuclear weapons and how to bring this issue to younger generations?
So I work with younger generations. A lot of them have been messaged in a really significant way that might is right and fascism is good. A lot of them do not know anything about international law, the United Nations. So like in my classes, I'm very hesitant to criticize some aspects of the United Nations, which I would normally do because it certainly needs reform in many ways. But the nuanced, that people need to be prepared, that students really, many of my students, I'm in a conservative school, are not prepared for what's ahead. And I work a lot on trying to explain to them that we have limited resources and that if those resources are used for nuclear weapons, we won't have the technological ability in terms of resources or in terms of brain power to do what we need to do to survive climate change and create justice, as long as all of that's going into nuclear weapons and other weapons. So that's kind of the angle I take with young people. Young people often school me about lots of things I don't know, but in terms of how, most of them, I check with them every term. Have you ever heard of the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons? They all, and I have 50 in each class. So this is 100 every 3 months, a new set of 100. I've been talking about these things since 2014 in my classroom. And I'd say maybe once or twice in all these years, a student said they knew about, activism and working against nuclear weapons. So mainstream society has certainly truncated this nuclear education from happening. So whatever we can do, and that's what the treaty really does provide, is talking. It's a reason to organize things, to talk to people, to have that public education, just like Mari and Jack are talking about. It's a perfect tool for that, despite I have criticisms of the treaty because they didn't center human rights for Indigenous groups. They are mentioned in the preamble. There is attention to them in terms of radiation exposure. But for me, in 2013 and 14, watching how it was being shaped and losing that opportunity was devastating. But I really think we should use the treaty to educate as much as we can and try every other avenue as well. Maybe movies work with students too. So I do movies and we discuss them after, things that could bring people in that aren't aware of nuclear weapons and then have a discussion after. Films like The Day the Earth Caught Fire, 1961, highly recommended for working with students.
In terms of political goals or trying to slow the nuclear weapons juggernaut in the United States, I'm not real hopeful in the current political climate. Biden has committed himself to the rebuilding the entire US nuclear weapons arsenal, manufacturing capacity, delivery systems, et cetera, that began under Obama and was continued by Trump. I was listening yesterday, we were tuned into one of the seminars about Daniel Ellsberg. There's a series of programs going on yesterday and today. And I have a lot of respect for Dan's insights on these matters. And he and Fred Kaplan, a historian there also, were speaking that if there's any way to crack open the US nuclear arsenal right now, it might be on the proposal for the new ground-based strategic defense. It'll be the acronym GBSD, but it's basically new missiles in new silos all across the Midwest to act as a nuclear sponge and give the Soviets or whoever they think our opponent is too many targets to overwhelm on a first strike. So maybe they won't strike at all, but it's going to cost us about $2 trillion just for that one component of nuclear weapons that the United States possesses and that they're upgrading. So the price tag and the utility and the whole philosophy of, oh, sure, we'll just set the Midwest aside as a sacrifice area in the event of a nuclear war. We all know the absurdity of all of the discussion about legitimizing the massacre of hundreds of millions of people. That's what we have to break through before we're going to break through on any sort of a policy level, I think, is to ask the question of if it's not wrong to plan for the slaughter of 300 million people, what is wrong? Because at this point, we may only have, sort of moral arguments, to change people's hearts. That's what changed mine at some point, is the contemplation of what it means. And yeah, it's been written out of history. Young people are not aware of US nuclear history, let alone the present circumstances. That was a failure on the movement's part to believe that the freeze and a couple of treaties was enough. The demand has to be for unilateral nuclear disarmament in the United States, because only by making an extreme demand that, yes, we started, we've got to stop it, do we create a political space for anybody else to have a lesser demand that may approach reducing the nuclear threat. I'm happy to be out here with, war tax resistors on the edge saying, no, enough, stop, never again.
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't think effective global nuclear disarmament is possible as long as we allow commercial use of plutonium and enriched uranium. So we have to make sure that we talk about nuclear energy issues as well to younger generation.
Yes.
In elementary school, they talk about sustainable energy in school, but they teach nuclear energy as a sustainable energy or clean energy, and we have to change that. And when you go to public libraries, they don't have, resources that talks about, nuclear energy and its costs. So somehow, like, we have to make a really, bold move and, have literature available for young people to teach, so that, nuclear, not just nuclear weapons, but nuclear energy is also evil. Another thing I want to say is that, we have this culture of glorification and in what do you call it? Like a glorification of war, which is deeply woven into our policies and laws. And we have to stop that. That is also helping military industrial complex to advance their interests. So that's something that we need to continue to teach younger generation.
Sure. So, or Linda, you had a follow-up comment?
Yeah, it's just that I wanted to go back to Jack's comment that, the peace movement didn't quite keep going like it needed to after the freeze. I have a student right now studying Hatfield and the freeze, and I lived through the freeze, right? So it's kind of interesting to have it come back and be looked at. Where does the ball drop, right? And I'm not really sure it's fair to blame the activists. One reason I look at the UN is then I can see the amount of momentum that's for nuclear. It's just overwhelming force, pro-nuclear in every aspect of technology, every aspect of our lives, medicine, education, power for development. One of my questions is, why does Linus Pauling fail in trying to get the human right? He actually had a legal suit to fight for the human right to not be contaminated or threatened by nuclear war. But it doesn't become a right. So why does he fail? And it's this overwhelming investment from all these other aspects, I think, and they get so centralized, and then they can just push everything out worldwide, globally through the UN. So it's kind of terrifying because the UN is thought of as this haven for human rights, right? But it's actually a place where the nuclear world was set up. And that's one reason why I was promoting Jacob's book that'll come out this summer, because it's just a glimmer of some of that. The Wretched Atom is what it's called. And it's the history of how this was all set up. And you can't, they hide the price of nuclear weapons inside producing uranium and enriching it for nuclear power. So by having those chains together, they hide and obscure how much is really going into the whole system.
Yeah, I'm not going to say which country, but one of the state parties that ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons produces uranium, and they supply uranium to nuclear weapon states. And it seems like they don't see a problem with that. And yeah, so.
So the next question kind of continues on from some of the remarks that each of you made. What is the connection between banning nuclear energy plants and being anti-war? Is the possessing of uranium for nuclear energy plants and processing of nuclear missiles different?
We could probably all chime in on that one. You can look at it as two sides of the same coin. The technology to create the uranium concentrations for nuclear power plant is exactly the same technology that's used for nuclear weapons. The nuclear power industry was heavily subsidized by the United States, creating the capacity to process uranium that way for nuclear weapons that then I kind of look at nuclear power as the failed apology of the nuclear weapons enterprise, that the peaceful atom was a bomb. They thought that they could somehow assuage the guilt of the bomb by using this tremendously concentrated source of energy for human development without fully considering, the health impact of the entire nuclear chain, from the mining of uranium, all the way to the disposal or the attempted disposal of the waste. So there is no difference, and Mari is exactly right that we have to attack nuclear energy and delegitimize nuclear energy as a legitimate source of electricity. That's all it gives us is electricity and waste. It doesn't give us, anything else directly. That needs to go as well, because the intellectual capacity that the nuclear weapons industry requires can only be sustained by a broader industry of nuclear power that's ostensibly for the creation of electricity. They need that scientific capacity continually generated in the universities. But to do it just for nuclear weapons, there's not enough. I mean, North Korea made and Pakistan made nuclear weapons without going down a full-scale nuclear energy path, because they were able to just get the plutonium that they needed in enough quantities and make their weapons. But here in the United States, the industries are deeply wedded.
Well, and I wanted to just add that, the nuclear energy industry very often subsidizes efforts to disarm nuclear weapons and tries to create the impression that there is a big difference between the two. And I think they've been quite successful. They've been much more successful than I have been. So that's something to keep in mind too. And it's purposeful. And then the other thing to bring out, just as from my history, is that, this wish of creating a equal world, it actually doesn't, nuclear technology doesn't, the dreams and wishes and utopian ideas of nuclear technology doesn't start with nuclear weapons. It starts with the Curies and this wish for nuclear medicine, and Frederick Soddy, who had this idea that this would be an energy that everyone could access, and that there would be equality around the world if it were done. And a lot of people who are proponents of nuclear, they offer that in their gut. They've got something positive that they're selling in their gut. And we've got this, right? And so I think just knowing what we're up against in a realistic way is very important. And that one thing that the treaty does is it gives us a window, like, look, we could create this alternative world where we survive climate change and we create justice. Gosh, wouldn't that be easy? We just take the money from nuclear weapons and invest it in the things we need. It's a snap, right? I know it's just, but it's something we can, it's a way that we can offer similar, instead of, I guess it's the two hands of nonviolence, right? Like, bring people in, stop hurting me. But I recognize your humanity. Please stop hurting me.
Yes. So Fukushima disaster was a wake-up call for me. And now, because of the nuclear energy and because they continue to lie that nuclear energy is safe, Fukushima happened. And this is also an environmental justice issue because Fukushima is a rural area and they didn't build nuclear power plant in Tokyo or big cities. And now they have this radioactive water stored in the facility, and Japanese government doesn't know what to do with it. So they claimed, finally they officially decided that they're going to dump radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean for the next decades. And United States basically approved that decision, and IAEA also approved that decision. Blinken was like, "Oh, thank you so much for your transparency in making decision." He tweeted that way. So everyone is, these nuclear industry, I think, is multinational entities, including international organizations. They are part of this, nuclear energy industry, promoting nuclear power, nuclear energy, with the cost of, right to health of ordinary people. So we need to continue to talk about how they undermine democracy, how they undermine, our health and right to health of, people, especially children, women, and vulnerable members of the communities, and how nuclear energy impacts and exploits indigenous communities, communities of color, mainly in terms of storing radioactive waste, not just uranium mining, but also, in the United States, storing radioactive waste might be placed in communities of color, and we should not, ignore these issues.
Thank you. Someone was just asking for a comment on the irony that most nuclear experts are being trained in the United States.
It's not really an irony. It was part of the plan. So the US from the beginning was bringing in people from all over the world to train them. In fact, at Oregon State University, I've gotten to see the records of them before Atoms for Peace even started, bringing in people to train them to be nuclear engineers. It really was thought of as this key to creating equality in these different countries, and lots of people bought into it. And they really imposed it quite successfully in many places. Many countries. Even if they didn't develop a nuclear power plant, they were trained or were given grants by the Atomic Energy Commission to set things up. The US had this huge unlimited amount of money for some reason, and they just gave it. And then they made sure that the companies profited. So the way that the way that aid works, technical aid, it has to benefit one of your home countries, right? So they would give a grant to a country to purchase something, but then that's bought from an American company, like a General Atomics, which is still one of the hugest, richest companies ever. So anyway. I think I said I don't know what it was anymore.
Well,
this-
after, oh, I'm
go
sorry.
ahead,
Go
Mark.
ahead, Jack, go ahead.
Well, I just was going to share a quote that Zia Mian shared yesterday on this seminar I was listening to that exemplifies how the universities have been captured on these subjects. He was testifying before Congress just 10 days ago. The head of the US Strategic Command, General Richard, he said the USA Stratcom works closely with world-class universities and education systems through our academic alliance, a partnership of over 60 institutions. The command, meaning our nuclear weapons command, advocates to incorporate deterrence history and theory, allied perspectives, the importance of treaties and alliances, an understanding of capabilities, delivery systems, weapons, and C2 capabilities into curriculums. The aim is to enhance understanding of our mission and the importance of strategic deterrence while further developing the nation's next generation of national security professionals. Together with professional military education, this creates a strategic advantage necessary for the interoperability across joint and allied forces. And that spells it out pretty clear that they're in the universities to sell them on the idea of nuclear deterrence and to groom a cadre of abusers.
Well,
I just wanted, oh,
Go ahead, Mari, you've been waiting.
yeah, I just wanted to add that, regarding the Atom for Peace, after the World War II, atomic bomb survivors were taken advantage by nuclear energy, and they were forced, they were deceived, and they play a role in promoting nuclear energy by saying that it's a peaceful way of use of nuclear. And they had horrible experience with the nuclear bombs, so they were deceived in that they wanted to gain something positive out of nuclear. And I met one of the atomic bomb survivors who spent entire career as an engineer in nuclear industry, and he was 70 something when I met him, but he realized, especially after Fukushima disaster, he was wrong, and he was young, and he felt very ashamed of being part of it. And another thing that I wanted to say is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congresswoman, she recently reintroduced the Green New Deal resolution. And last year, she mentioned that nuclear could be part of the Green New Deal. So at one of the town hall meetings, I asked her whether nuclear is still part of the Green New Deal. And this was the answer that I got. She said that, quote, "What I think is very important about the Green New Deal is that it is technology agnostic. So the Green New Deal does not take a formal position for or against any specific technology. It is strict about 10-year timeline on reducing carbon emissions. So when it comes to the question of nuclear, it's agnostic on it. Doesn't take a position of pro or anti. But what is important is that we want to support decarbonization efforts that have a just process that helps us hit our target within 10 years. Unquote. So very interesting comment.
Yeah, I don't want people to give up, but we are up against just a lot. And the thing about Zia Man's testimony about how ingrained all that is, that they were explicit about it is, they brag about it too, at times, but most people, I guess, don't realize how purposeful all of this is. And Zia Man, actually, he and I argued years ago, he was against the treaty, and then he came around to it. So when things like that happen, I go, okay, things can fix, things can get better. So as much as we're up against a lot, things can change really quick.
Yeah, I think that,
I mean, we argued intensely. There's a picture of us arguing online if you want to see it. But anyway.
I think that was one of Daniel Ellsberg's points yesterday, was that, yeah, he's pretty, if he looks at it objectively, yeah, the situation's looking pretty hopeless. But then he went through a whole litany of totally unexpected things that have happened in our lifetimes that have changed the direction of historical progress or human progress. So we should not rule out the possibility that, yeah, amazing things could happen. Our job is to be ready, you know, and to be doing this education work, you know, that we're all engaged in, to lay the foundation so that when those shifts in consciousness occur, we might have, improve our chances.
When I kind of just want to segue back to all the things, that both of you, Jack and Mari, are doing. I mean, those are all the right things to be doing, right? To do that kind of education and outreach is amazing. But I also wanted to say, Bill's idea of let's have a city council measure also brings people around to talk about these
Absolutely.
things. We need these kind of talking points and opportunities, right? So we can get the message across, like there really is only a limited earth. And I just wanted to respond to this consumerism that came up on the chat. The bywords I've had in my whole life were live simply so others could simply live, which is Frances Moore LePay. If I hadn't read her book, I don't know who I'd be. But I read her book, so I started to see that, right? Live simply so other, and I started to see what goes into things that are made, right? And that things aren't replaceable. And so that kind of mind shift, if it could change me, it could change anyone. So there's no reason we can't make it out of this mess, but we are in a mess.
Yeah, I'll just read one last comment, the comment that Linda was talking about, and I think also bounces back on what Mari was just speaking to. And so I'll read that last comment, then give each of our speakers one more chance to either comment on that or anything they'd like to touch base on, and then we'll close this session. So as someone had mentioned and was seconded, that the video story of Stuff is also a good resource connecting to that consumerism that feeds our desire and need, quote unquote, for energy, but also how that then relates to the New Deal, which really is not doing anything to dissuade consumerism. So I guess kind of throwing out there consumerism, the Green New Deal, and your last words. So maybe we'll go through the order that we began with. If you want to go first, Mari.
Sure. Yeah, I think we have so much stuff now, and nuclear energy was also promoted as if we need this kind of technology when we already had something, as energy sources. So now we are going back to solar and wind. So we have to review what we need. And and my last words, I just want to repeat that we need to also talk about nuclear energy. Otherwise, effective global nuclear disarmament is not possible. So I will continue to talk about how plutonium and enriched uranium were produced from nuclear energy and how that is also a threat to this world. So thank you so much for inviting me to today's panel. It's a great honor to speak with other distinguished guests, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Jack?
Well, I'll thank you. It was a pleasure to meet Mari now and to chat with Linda a little bit online and to present today. Yeah, the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons opens up a lot of possibilities, and those possibilities are going to be created by our activity. And what's happening with the resolution in Corvallis, that is the most basic of kind of grassroots educational organizing that can happen on this subject, is to say, wait a minute, where is our money going? And do we really want our money to go there? And that can happen, like you say, right on your local level. It can happen with you and your banker. So we create hope. Hope is a verb.
Thank you, Jack. Linda?
I really was just so honored to be with everyone here today. And I'm really excited and energized by the conversations we've had and the questions that came to us. You are all used to resistance, everyone here, right? Tax resistors, all the kinds of resistance. But I just want to applaud you for all the things you're embracing as well. And embracing this better future that we know we can make if we just have that hope and just keep going. Gandhi said that he felt nonviolence was its own energy. And I really believe that. It's love action or truth force, a satyagraha. When we tap into that energy, we can do magical things. And that's what he said. He knew he was doing magical things. So please know that you are doing magical things, no matter how small. So thank you.
Right, and I think I'll lead all of us in the audience here in a very warm and gracious thank you for all of your wisdom and knowledge and everything you've shared with us from your lives today.
Oh my, I can clap louder.